Hello and welcome to the latest session of the Info Security Magazine Online Summit 2023. My name is James Coker, Deputy Editor, Info Security Magazine, and I'll be your moderator for this next panel discussion session of the event. So for the next 60 minutes, we're going to be discussing the topic, Managing Cyber Risks, a Question of Good Governance. This session is sponsored by S&P Global Ratings, and to find out more about S&P's Global Rating solutions and services, you can download a document available in the Attachments tab. Now, before I introduce you to our panel of speakers, I just want to run through a few bits of housekeeping. Firstly, you can submit any questions that you might have for our panel using the Submit a Question button, and you can let us know if a question is for a particular speaker, and we'll do our best to answer it before the end of the session. We'll also be running a few polls throughout the session, so please do join in with those as and when they appear. No right or wrong answers on those. We're just very interested to get your views. In terms of CPE credits, all of our sessions qualify our viewers for CPE and CPD credits based on the minimum attendance time, and you can view the document in the Attachments tab on your screen for full information about this. And finally, do head to our sponsor section. Our sponsor section, which can be found in our resources tab, to take a look at those who are supporting the event. But without further ado, I will now come to each of our panelists in turn, just to ask you to give a quick introduction to yourselves to the audience, if that's okay. Ian, could I start with you, please?
Hello there, my name's Ian Hill. I'm Director of Information and Cybersecurity for Up Corporation. We're a large regional broadband provider now owned by Virgin Media O2.
Lovely, thank you. Mark, I'll go to you next.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name's Mark Ward. I'm a Senior Research Analyst at the ISF. That's the Information Security Forum. If you're in security, you may well know it. We produce all kinds of guidance on how to do information security well, based on quite a few of the research documents and other guides. Before joining ISF, I was a journalist for many years as well, covering cybersecurity.
Thank you, Mark. And Laurie, could I come to you next?
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Laura Lydon. I'm responsible for security governance and assurance in the medtech/digital healthcare space. I've worked in a number of different security management roles for over 15 years now, with a wide range of different organizations, ranging from startups to global regulated organizations, listed organizations, and as a consultant as well. So I've worn both hats.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. And Matt, could I come to you next?
Thanks. Good morning. I'm Matt Phillips. I'm a director at Guidehouse in their cybersecurity practice. Guidehouse is a global advisory company with about 16,000 employees, and we serve everything from defense and security to healthcare, energy, as well as the financial markets.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Martin, finally.
Hi everyone, I'm Martin Whitworth, and basically after 30 odd years working in operational security roles, I'm now at S&P Global Ratings, where I lead our R&D into cyber risk as part of our emerging risks team.
Perfect. Thank you very much, guys. And yeah, I'm sure the audience will agree, a really good broad and varied panel to discuss this very important topic. So before we dive into the discussion, I just want to launch our first poll question of the session. And this is, does the board at your organisation have a good understanding and involvement in cyber governance and risk management? And this will be a topic that we'll be definitely talking about in this session. So the options for this are A, yes, IT and cyber leaders have regular meetings with the board that has built good understanding in this area. B, no, there are regular meetings, but difficulties in communicating these issues to the board. C, no, there is very little interest or involvement of the board in IT and cyber risk. Or D, other. So please do send in your thoughts and we'll review those responses later on in the session. So to kick off the discussion, Laura, perhaps if I could start with you, could I sort of ask you about how the cyber risk landscape has evolved over your career and what are kind of the most significant elements for security leaders to consider today?
Sure. So the biggest shift really for me, particularly even in the last few years, has been evolution of threat actors, evolution of attacks, and the monetization of cybercrime. Ultimately, those are the things that have driven the advances we've seen in TTPs, the advances we've seen in the sophistication of the organisation of cybercrime companies. They are sophisticated organisations in their own right now, and the availability of cybercrime as a service. Fundamentally, even turning the clock back 5, 6, 7 years, monetization was still recent years, let alone in the last 15 plus.
Yeah, it's a huge change in the cyber threat landscape. And Martin, could I get your thoughts on this area, the biggest shifts you're seeing?
Yeah, I suppose I'll take a slightly different tack and say that from a risk point of view, it's not that many years ago where risk discussions in a risk committee or in a boardroom didn't actually include anything to do with information security or cyber security. And so I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen in the development of the landscape is the way that organizations look at it. So it's definitely the case that if you go into most organizations now, they're at least aware that they should be thinking about the cyber risk. And obviously some organizations take it well beyond that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll kind of go on a slightly different tack now. And Ian, if I could come to you, to what extent has kind of the growth in government and perhaps industry regulations and guidelines been placing more cybersecurity responsibilities on the board and C-suite, and to what extent has that changed the way organisations are approaching cyber governance in your experience?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're seeing more regulations coming in, and particularly in our world in telecommunications, you've got the Telecommunications Securities Act, which is a big one that's landed on us recently. We're seeing the Online Security Act and things like that. So definitely, government regulations is now putting more of the onus and more of the accountability on businesses and information security, the CISOs and the likes, and we're seeing that more and more. So it's only going to get worse. I think that I think we're only going to see more regulations. We're going to see tightening of regulations, and I will see, Steve, part of the problem as well. Some of the regulations, like if you look at the Online Security Act, there's some worrying vagaries in some of the definitions within these regulations, which can be open to serious scope creep, which will impact us.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps, Matt, if I could come to you and just get your perspective, perhaps from the other side of the pond as well, some of the regulations that are coming in there.
Well, I think we've seen a shift in cybersecurity going from an IT function and being very technical to almost being an all of government process. If you look at what's happening with the Cybersecurity Information and Security Organization, you're looking at all the regulatory bodies. Just in New York State, the financial organization has just expanded their cyber regulation. So we're continuing to see that, and now cyber is becoming much more of a business problem than it always has been an IT problem. And it is bringing the onus onto senior leaderships and boards to be aware and to understand the risk in their environment from a cyber perspective. And that's really because, and Laura kind of said it early, the change in the environment, in that today, it's not about stealing data and then selling data on the black market to go be used somehow. It is monetizing cybersecurity almost immediately, right? It's the cyber actors and the nation state and nation state sponsored capabilities that are allowing cyber actors to come in here and impact the business day one and immediately be able to monetize their criminal activity and hide it through cryptocurrency, in other ways. And so we're just seeing that the impact of the business is greater. And so the leadership is now being forced to go pay attention to what's going on from a cyber perspective, because it's not an IT function that could be, hey, fixed with a patch. It is an all of the company kind of understanding of what the cyber risk environment or threat environment is. And then are we doing the right things to be able to mitigate those risks? So that now that the boards are engaged and boards are actively being told they need to understand cyber risk, and senior leadership, that kind of flows down. And now senior leadership has to be engaged from a business perspective and understand the threats in the environment and how they impact overall business risk.
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge sea change, and one that definitely organizations are still getting to grips with. And Mark, if I could come to you and just ask for your perspective on what's some has been said and what you've seen as the biggest evolution in this area.
Big shift, yeah. I mean, certainly I'd agree. Yeah, just how serious cybercrime is. I remember when I started as a journalist on a trade paper, didn't have an email address, so that shows how old I was. But I think, and all the attacks back then were very much of that kids showing off kind of thing, and it's just got more and more serious. And certainly the closing days of my career as a journalist, you know, the number of breaches we could have written about and just the number of attacks was just ridiculous. And certainly now I've jumped the fence, if that's the phrase, and you know, talk to lots more people running very large organizations and trying to get security done. Yeah, they're under attack all the time. So yeah, it's just the pace of it and how nasty it gets, and as that attention that falls on it as well. But I think, I mean, there's a real tension at the heart of this though, because governance is difficult to do, really. I think sometimes it's a bit like getting you know, people around a campfire to sing Kumbaya or something like that. Somebody's got to start it, somebody's got to get it going. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do, because sometimes you're just telling people to do the same things, but it's not, you know, but in a more secure way. So I think the change we saw in the governance research last year was very much about working with the business, not telling them what to do, finding out their problems, solving those, and you know, that kind of change in the way that governance is done, because often those governance people, there's only a couple of them in very large organizations. You need allies, you need to have that influence spread across the organization. So it's become a much bigger deal, and definitely.
Yeah, definitely. And Ian, we discussed a little bit in our pre-event call, and just while we're talking about the context around cyber governance, I was wondering if this might be a good time to bring in, if you could give share your experiences really of having a cyber audit up quite recently, because I know it's quite an interesting story.
Yes, I mean, if people are not aware, so Up Corporation are a very large regional broadband company, and they were set up by a company called Letter One Holdings, which was owned by some Russian investors. Those Russian investors were subsequently sanctioned because of the war in Ukraine. And under the Investment Securities Act, the government then decided that Up under Russian ownership was a risk to national security. So they put in place, it's called a final order. So on the 19th of December, Grant Shapps decided that Letter One Holdings had to sell the entirety of Up Broadband, but in the meantime had to do a full-on security audit. Something very unique, never been done before. So it was very, so this wasn't against any specific standard. This was, if you like, an ad hoc audit, very, very deep, very intrusive audit to basically, I think, prove that there wasn't Russian infiltration into Up. And that was, I'd say it's a stressful 6 months that was. Eventually it all worked out and the company was successfully sold to Virgin Media O2. But it was quite interesting because it was a very unique experience because, as I say, it was not against any particular regulation or standard. And it was quite unique. And I think possibly this might set a trend for the future in this sort of when we're talking about national security.
Sorry, just lost control of the screen a bit. Yeah, that's really interesting, Ian, and thank you for sharing that. I know it was and it's really sort of interesting to hear that perspective for this discussion and its relevancy to organisations. perhaps before we kind of move on a bit more to developing an effective cyber governance strategy in this landscape, I just wanted to go back a bit more to the regulation aspects. I know this was another topic that we talked about quite a lot in our pre-discussion. So Matt, perhaps I'll come to you. Like we've seen some instances recently, some quite high-profile cases where either senior leadership or security leaders themselves have been held personally liable for breaches and cybersecurity incidents. So I just wanted to ask you about how that is likely to change the cyber governance landscape and how organizations approach this area.
I think part of what you're talking about is really the charging of the SolarWinds Chief Information Security Officer. I think that drastically changes the landscape. If you remember, we talk about the evolution of the Chief Information Security Officer, and we call them chiefs, but a lot of times they do not have a seat at the table. They sit in IT, or they may sit below a Chief Risk Officer or other areas. And we sort of, prior to this, the SolarWinds, we sort of saw more and more of the CISO sort of moving back towards belonging in IT. And we saw them becoming a little more, in the trend towards being more technical on that side. I think this is going to shift that pendulum very quickly to, CISOs are going to demand a seat at the table. They're going to demand that veto. But we're also going to see where I think this is going to come out in public. And more that's going to say, listen, I was getting pressure from management and the board. This is how my budget was managed and how my budget was restricted and those type of things. And that's a battle that we don't want to be in, right? So I really think, this is going back to cybersecurity is a team sport, and it has to start from the top down. And so I think we're going to see, obviously we're seeing the regulation around reporting with the SEC, in the US with the reporting into the CISO organization within 72 hours of a breach. And all of those things are going to continue to, first, they're going to impact publicly traded companies, and then we're going to see that shift down. So it is going to be critical that organizations, from the C-suite to the board, understand cybersecurity frameworks, right? What should our company be aligning to? And then understanding how it's measured back to those frameworks and those areas of control. Not every company has to do it exactly the same, but I do think we're going to see a real shift in CISOs having a seat at the table. It's not only going to be just the audit committees that are going to get briefed by the CISO, but the full boards. I think those things are going to happen a lot more often. And so we're going to see a big focus, because nobody, right? Nobody wants to be on the front page of the newspaper. Nobody wants to be the next person sued because I didn't spend enough money, or I really didn't understand the risk of my choices that I forced down on an IT or an IT organization or CISO. They're really going to have to understand the process of risk management and understand that those processes are within the company are being followed. And then they have a way to say, here's my risk tolerance, right? Here is how we're managing risk. And did what was brought to the governance committee or the board or whatever, did it fit within that risk tolerance? And how did we make our decision? I think those things are going to have to be visible. And I think we're just going to continue to see more and more regulations that's going to drive the rigor and discipline around risk processes within an organization. The risk management framework, is the NIST risk management framework is going to become everybody's best friend.
Sorry, John.
We're all going to jump in at once now. Watch. I think the transparency element is super, super important, and justification, because I think what's clear already in the world we live in is that we can't all do everything. And having that justification, having that transparency around the decisions that are made by businesses is going to be absolutely key. And that's what the regulations are going to strive for as they come in.
Can I just say that as well, we already have levels of accountability. So if you look in the financial world, we have the SMCR, the Senior Management Certification Regime. So we're already seeing now where roles are being held accountable under things like the SMCR. And I think, again, regulation, we'll probably see expansion of that into other areas, not just in the financial services industries.
Yeah, just to break in, because I did some work, I say, on governance last year, and what was really interesting about that, chatting to lots of CISOs, was that they were very keen to push that risk back to the parts of the organisation that and make that part of the organisation accept it. And now, if all of a sudden the authorities are saying, no, actually, a lot of this devolves onto the CISO, then yeah, I think Matt is right. That's going to be a big shift, because you are going to want something in return. If you're in the sites, suddenly you're thinking, well, if this is my responsibility, then definitely I need support, and I need everyone to understand what everyone is doing. So I think, yeah, it's going to be an interesting, bring about some very interesting discussions. A lot of organisations, a lot of CISOs have been overlooked, and I think will think, yeah, this is my moment to get that support and get that recognition of what we're doing.
I think that's correct. I think also what we're going to see is a change in the way that the whole topic is discussed. It's one thing being called in front of a board, or being called in front of an audit or a risk committee, if you like a CISO to be there to tell them what's gone wrong. What I think we will see is a lot more engagement. It needs to be a joint effort here with the discussion with the rest of the business executives and the non-exec. And I think also what we're going to see is if you like a little, Ian touched on this before. A lot of the regulations that come out at the moment are not particularly well thought out as far as some of the measurements and that are in there. The SEC one, the latest SEC one's a prime example, because it talks about reporting incidents that are material, but doesn't actually explain what materiality comprises. So I think we're going to have to see a lot more clarity there. So transparency is great, but we need clarity about what it is we're needing to report and why. And I think unless there's a discussion that takes place, all you're going to get is a load of regulations that organizations will do their best to not have to report. So at the moment, I know there are lots of discussions about, how do we show that this is not a material incident so we don't have to report it? It encourages the wrong sort of behavior unless there's some clarity there.
Yeah, I think you're seeing that with AI at the moment. There's an awful lot of organisations are rushing to get all their AI systems in place because those regulations are going to hit them really hard, really soon. And I think they're going to want to be in that position and say, well, look, we built it, we spent a lot of money, so we're going to adjust it afterwards. But yeah, they don't want to get caught out too soon.
Also, you're on mute, Matt, I think.
But I think it is, for me, I really like it. I think it's going to force companies to now, when we talk about financial materiality, we're now beginning to go force them to define risk tolerance in materiality terms. And it gets to be really easy to go talk about what a tier 1 incident versus a tier 2 or tier 3 incident, when we can talk and define them in terms of materiality. And in that clause itself is going to force governance committees and senior leaderships and business executives to do a better job of defining that for the chief information security officer and his or her team, so that they understand what is really important and what isn't important, and how to help focus that back to the board. Because let's be honest, we as as practitioners, sometimes we get myopic and we think the very smallest thing is the most critical thing in the world, and I need business's attention to go fix it today. When you really go look at the overall risk, maybe it's behind firewalls, maybe it's not publicly facing, and it's a threat and a vulnerability, but it's 3 tiers down, right? So it's really going to help those teams, and I see early on, help those teams align with the business on what's important and what needs to be taken, and what actions need to be taken to go remediate risk. So I think that coming out of the gate and trying to define the SEC, trying to define that really tightly would send everybody into a tailspin. I think the way they did it is really going to help companies begin exercising that muscle that I hadn't seen very few companies do really well, and that's define risk tolerance and materiality.
Thank you so much, guys. That was really interesting insights there. And I think it's probably a good time to look at the question, the first poll question, which is related to this area. So as a reminder, the question was, does the board at your organisation have a good understanding and involvement in cyber governance and risk management? 46% said yes, IT leaders have regular meetings with the board that has built good understanding. 37% said there was regular meetings but difficulties communicating these issues to the board. So that's definitely a topic we'll be touching upon in a moment. 12% said no, there is very little interest or involvement from the board in cyber. So that's slightly concerning, but at least the vast majority, there seem to be regular meetings with the board. And 3% other. And if you wanted to tell us what that other was, feel free to send that in the question function. Just before we dive into the conversation again, I'll just launch our second poll question, which is, what is the biggest challenge security teams face in developing an effective cyber governance strategy? And so the options for this are A, understanding and working with the board and wider business, B, compliance with increasing rules and regulations, C, rising cyber threats, D, too much pressure, workload on security teams, or E, other. So once again, please do send in your thoughts. Really appreciate it. And so just to kind of go on to that topic around building the relationship with the board and sort of working with the business more effectively. Laura, perhaps if I could start with you. What advice do you have for security leaders to sort of effectively understand their business priorities and establish that risk appetite?
So I'm going to say up front, both engagement and embedding. They're words that we use a lot. But when we sort of take a step back and unpack, what do we really mean by engaging with stakeholders? What do we really mean by building strong stakeholder relationships? What do we really mean by embedding ourselves in our businesses, our functions, security as a function within business processes? It's about really fostering a deep and embedded understanding of any organization and being a normal part of every BAU process that strengthens the organization in delivering on its goals and its objectives. For me, it's about not being something to the side or something extra, but the security function being integral to the delivery of both business processes from an operational standpoint, but from a tactical and strategic standpoint. I think we've already talked about having a seat at the table, genuinely being part of the leadership of an organization and there to support on the organizational objectives and part of forming both the agenda from a security standpoint and helping guide and support the business agenda, I think are the really key things for me. Being there, being present, being engaged, and being embedded.
Martin, I'll get your thoughts on that. Oh, you're still on mute. Sorry.
Right. Hi. Yeah. So I think it's one of those things that is sometimes easier said than done. The obvious answer is, how do you get more engagement? Well, you need to communicate. You need to communicate with the board. You need to communicate with the business leaders. No, that's fine, but how do you do it? How do you actually establish those relationships? And that requires a bit of work. You need to make those appointments. You need to go and see people. You need to take an interest in what the business does. I used to work as an industry analyst, a bit like Mark, and I was amazed at the number of times I'd talked to CISOs where I asked them, well, what's your last financial report say about the performance of the organization? And they hadn't read it. If you want to be a leader, if you want a seat at that table, then it's not one that's just going to be given to you. You've got to earn it. So you need to understand your business. And at the very least, you should understand what's in your annual reports, what your executives are saying about your company and what your business strategy is. So I think there's a lot of work to do. You need to find a couple of partners, a couple of mentors, a couple of people who you can really go to, especially when you're talking about non-execs. So if you're talking about non-executive directors, you need a sounding board. If you're going to go to the board and present and talk about things that could impact business strategy, then you better have tested them out on someone who understands that before you go in there and potentially shoot yourself in the foot. So it's a lot of hard work, and that means you've got to set time aside in your calendar to do that, and make it known to your reporting line that you're doing that, and that is part of your job. It's not something that's added on. It's part of your job to do that.
That's really, really great advice. Mark, perhaps I'll ask you about some of the research that you've done in this area.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the research brought out all those points that have been raised so far. But the tension within governance is that, you definitely need that high level support. Getting that can be tricky unless you're the CISO and you have can build up some allies on the board, but definitely management by walking around, going to see people, understanding your organization is a big part of it. But as well, I think but it goes deeper than that, because you need to understand how your organization works. Where those cultures of influence are, who has the purse strings, who's interested in this as well, and try and use those, do a lot, because the board is just one place where those decisions are made and discussions are had, and there's organizations run in all kinds of ways. There's all kinds of weird pockets of culture you can uncover and get to know and start to use in a good way as well, because that's the other side of this, is that I said, in governance, you're always outnumbered, you're always outgunned, so you definitely need those allies elsewhere in the organization. And because what you're trying to do is create a culture in some respects, as Laura said, get people doing the right kinds of things just by dint of business as usual. And that's difficult because you're on your own. You can get that support, you can get the high level people saying, yes, we respect this and need to do it, and you can show the consequences of not doing it. But yeah, it's a hard job, and everyone needs to be moving in the same kind of direction. But that can be difficult if you don't get that support, be it budget, be it vocal support as well, or those other people elsewhere in the organization moving in the same direction, doing the right kinds of things.
Yeah,
I think one of the problems we find, especially with large organizations, is a certain level of detachment from at the board level over how the business functions. Sort of classic, strategic view. The board decides where we're going, and then it's down to senior management, etc., to decide how you're going to get there. And a lot of the case because security, as colleagues there are suggesting, security is embedded in everything. So often the board don't necessarily understand how the business works at a sort of at a granular level. And I think it's really important for CISOs. They've sort of got a foot in both camps. And I think it's really important for the CISOs, obviously, to engage with the board, but also all the way down to the coalface, to understand how the business functions, what's functioning, how the process works, because it all impacts on security. And it's an interesting job, because then, for a CISO, once you understand how that all works, then you can sort of look from a strategic perspective, from a risk perspective, and find a way of communicating to that to a board in a way that they'll understand and support you without necessarily knowing how half of these business processes work. They know they work, and and I think it's because security is in everything. It's embedded in everything. I think that gives the CISO role an interesting challenge
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges is just the word governance. Nobody likes the G word. People don't like having governance done to them. And I think that's the other problem, that you have to try and find ways to get people to do this without them really knowing what you're actually trying to get them to do. And that's a bit of not quite a propaganda or snow job, but there's a definite selling aspect to this, and and you can make that work by understanding what they do, and trying to make sure that they do it in a way that respects that risk appetite and the security responsibilities and activities as well. But that makes that CISO job very difficult and interesting, because there's real challenges there to make that work and make it land.
I think one of the most critical messages I found useful, and Laura will know this because she's heard this before, is getting the business to understand what security is about. Because the business, the boards will look at things from a monetary perspective. What's this costing me? And they say cybersecurity is a huge cost. It's like, wow. And I'm often sort of banging on about that. It's so critical that the business understand that security is not there to bring value. It's there to protect value. Unless you're a cybersecurity company. And I think getting that message across to the board, not to see information security and cybersecurity as a cost, but what are we protecting, and trying to, this is where you get the risk side of things, because it's very difficult to put a value on what cybersecurity is protecting, if that makes sense. What is the value it's actually protecting? I think that's quite an important message to get across to the board.
In terms of that, as you touched upon the importance of being able to communicate effectively with the board and speak their language, so to speak, Matt, perhaps if I could get your experience on how to do this effectively. And obviously mentorship's been mentioned, but is taking courses a good option for cybersecurity in business, for cybersecurity leaders as well, for example?
I'll never say training is a bad thing. I think, working with your board is an art, and some boards are more technical than others, and you're going to have to learn. I think in every situation you can't come and say, hey, here's the 5 or 10 metrics that I talked to boards about. I don't think that always really works. You've got to understand your board. You've got to understand the focus of the business, and you're going to go through a process of learning what's important with them, and how to get your message across to them. Some boards love details. Some want, give me 3 bullets on a slide and I'm good. And you've got to learn how to get your point across in 3 bullets on the slide sometimes, or you got to do it in 60 slides because the boards want everything. And so you're going to have to learn that. I've never heard a board say, you're spending too much money on cybersecurity, stop. I always hear boards say, what do you need from us to be successful? And I mean, that's almost every board I've been in. It's never been, hey, don't go spend that money. I don't like where you're going. It's, what do you need from us to secure the company? And I think that is the challenge at that next level of governance that I think is critically important. It's those key business leaders, it's compliance, it's legal, it's IT, it's a cybersecurity officer, and it's them getting together at a regular time to talk about and understand for that business what are the key cyber metrics and what are they looking at, what are those indicators that tell them they need that their risk is going up. What are those key things that are doing that? And then are they together in how they want to invest and implement those capabilities and remediate those vulnerabilities and risk? That is the key thing. And it is never the same at any company. And you can't take these 10 metrics and go take them to 20 other companies. Right, you're going to have to go develop that, and it's a continual cycle of learning and walking through. But I will tell you, I think the most important piece of governance is that what I'll call the Security Governance Council, whatever you want to call it in your company, and that's the key business leaders around the table with the CIO and the CISO, who are really getting down to where are risk and vulnerabilities, where do we need to invest, where do we need to spend more time integrating and integrating our capabilities and our processes so that we've got a good risk picture, and what does that look like? I think the boards are always going to be, you're going to have to figure that out. That's a dance, and you got to know them. It's that next level of governance that really helps the cybersecurity organization embed and integrate and really drives the visibility and the culture that we talked about of security within the company. So for me, that is the hardest area to go build and go find the right people, as we talked about earlier, who are really engaged and create those relationships so that we really have substantive talks around cyber risk and integrating security in everything we do in the business.
I think there's some great points there from Matt, and I think the key one is that no two boards are the same, and no two execs are the same. And I think if you're going to want to learn, you read these trite statements, you've got to learn to speak the language of the board, the language of the business, or whatever. You need to find out what that language is, and honestly, through experience, and it's worth asking the question, because I've asked it and been surprised at the answer, but asking to sit in on a board meeting or a part of a board meeting or an exec committee meeting, or maybe it's another business, it's your risk committee. As an observer, a silent observer is incredibly valuable, because it gives you the insight, as Matt says, how these people work. Are they detailed people in advance, or are they detailed people at the meeting? Do you do 3 bullet points at the meeting and provide them a lot in the board pack, or vice versa? So I think understanding the personalities is so important to teach you what you need to learn. And I think there was a big fad, if you like about 15 years ago or 20 years ago, when people thought, well, the only thing to do is for the CISO to do an MBA. Well, great, great getting a qualification. That's not necessarily going to help you in your business if that's not going to teach you the way that your particular execs and non-execs work. So it's a really individual thing for the organization, and it is cultural.
I think style and communication are important, definitely. I think the story that we're telling is also incredibly important, and that story goes back to what are we really needing to prioritize? Where are our risks, and where is the value to the organization? And ultimately, risk and value prioritization in the context of all of the other business priorities, from both a risk and opportunity standpoint. And that's where our story comes to life. So actually being able to communicate what that story says in business terms and in support of where the organization's going and what it's trying to achieve is, for me, where the real work is.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. That's really interesting there on how to communicate effectively. Sort of as mentioned quite a few times about the getting buy-in from different areas of the business into this cyber governance aspect. So, Mark, perhaps if I could come to you. What advice would you have for organizations in terms of developing a kind of transparent cyber governance strategy? So establishing accountability for different roles across the organization, and also potentially the supply chain as well.
Yeah, it's a tough one, because like I say, the general experience we find in a lot of ISF member organizations is that governance is done by a couple of people at most. And to that point about every board is different, every organization is different as well. So it's hard to make it, for those two people to have that significant influence across the organization. So yeah, you've got to reach out. That communication is very important. And I'd say that management by walking around is definitely part of it, just getting them to understand what they need you to do as a governance or InfoSec organization, and doing that as well. And that's allied to understanding your maturity and what can you do for the organization. You shouldn't try to run before you can walk. So I think there's some basic stuff there you can do. But certainly we've seen, I think, and if this is probably a result of that tension, as the CISO gets pulled up more to that senior level, sits on the board, then they can slightly lose touch with the InfoSec organization and what it's doing. So we're starting to see the rise of BISOs, business information security officers, who are kind of in orbit around the CISO and who are embedded. And in some respects, they're an evolution of those security champions a lot of organizations put out in different parts of the organization as it's changing. Perhaps some people involved in change management, project leads or something like that, sort of helping out with, because undoubtedly there'll be a tech or security element to some of those bigger projects if they're actually transforming the business using all that data that they've got in place. So I think we're seeing that start to happen, and that can from the ground up start to get that that raise that maturity, that level of understanding, and get those good practices in place. But it's a long-term problem. I think that's what I found with quite a few CISOs. They look down the road, and it's not months, it's definitely years to get this right. And then your organization will change undoubtedly several times between now and the end point, and you'll get knocked back a couple of levels in terms of maturity and governance, and you have to keep going. It's relentless. It's just never done, because your organization just is, is constantly in motion, more so than ever, I think. So it's a tough job. You need friends while you're going down there, and allies, but it's definitely possible. We've seen some great, good practice developed in governance, and it really makes a difference as well. And that's one of the things that helps it land, is that you can help the organization do a better job all around.
I think one of the problems I've seen, I've learned from that perspective, is the old style hierarchical, autocratic sort of cultures where it's top down, and in the cyber and the InfoSec has sort of become a siloed empire within a business. I'm seeing a lot of changes now, where you're seeing more drift towards more federated, InfoSec and CyberSec across, where it's not being driven by this sort of mini empire, but it's actually being more federated and distributed out through the business. And I think that this is the key to sort of forward-thinking governance, where make people responsible for their areas from a security perspective. They understand their areas, they understand their business processes, put much more sort of responsibility for the governance of information security within their areas. Obviously, you still need overarching sort of strategy, but not sort of authoritarian, you must do this, and are much more spread out, because ultimately, as we all know, security is everyone's problem and everyone's responsibility. So actually make that part of the business culture, I think, and there's more and more companies starting to get that and to evolve that more federated approach.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that. A couple of organizations have done away with their CISO, actually, and they've just become much more business oriented. And actually, they've got sub CISOs, if that's for terms, spread across the organization, because they're becoming much more loosely coupled, and they do need that everyone to sort of move in the same direction, but they don't put too many mandates around how exactly they should get to those secure ways of working, and what controls and things. But they definitely instill that understanding of what's at stake and how it needs to be protected. And that's kind of an interesting development.
I think democratization is hugely powerful in the way that Ian spoke about federating or democratizing security and putting security in the hands of functions to deliver as part of their processes. But I think, just coming back to your point also about integration, integrated governance, I think becomes incredibly important then. And I think it's still important to make sure that there is some sort of cohesion and coordination around strategy, because if we lean too far into the democratization direction, we then suddenly end up with multiple technical solutions, for example, to solve a single problem. We come up with different ways of addressing a problem that actually increases our attack surface, and many, many, many other consequences. There are, as much as there are upsides to democratization, there are also downsides as well. And I think that cohesion and that coordination of strategic vision is still hugely important. But how you get there, for me, integrated governance.
It's great to hear there is progress being made in that respect. And as you said, it's not so much the old-fashioned sort of one leader dictates type of approach, which is good to see. But yeah, definitely an evolution coming in this area. Just before we dive into some audience questions that have been submitted, I just want to review the responses to our second poll question, which, as a reminder, was what is the biggest challenge security teams face in developing an effective cyber governance strategy? So it's quite an even spread of responses. 28% said understanding and working with the board and wider business. 23% said compliance with increasing rules and regulations. 23% also said rising cyber threats. 20% said too much pressure, workload on security teams, and 5% other. So yeah, quite an interesting, quite an even spread really between the different issues, many of which we've discussed in this session. So we've just entered the final 10 minutes of the session, and I'd like to go through a few of the audience questions that have come in. So one of our audience members has asked, as someone that is new to cybersecurity but has a big interest in GRC, is there any advice you can give for someone who's trying to break into the industry, sort of whether it's certification, skill to hone on, networking, etc.? Matt, perhaps if I could come to you with that.
Well, there's many different ways to get into the GRC. You find a lot of people start with coming in and their formal IT auditor or those type of things. But I got to tell you, just understanding and really getting into looking at any type of the classes around security management, any of those type of things, because really when you talk about governance, risk, and compliance, you start thinking about frameworks. How do I go build a cyber organization? How do I line all of my compliance up? And then what are those frameworks to make sure that we have the appropriate programming controls in place? So, if you want to be a certified information security manager, those are the type of certifications that are great to begin starting with. But, coming from the practitioner side, it is not bad either. You can come from a strict policy side of the world. There's a lot of different ways to get into the GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance side of it. You can come from the audit side, you can come from the practitioner side, and there is a plethora of different types of education and certifications that will at least help you understand the process and how to pull it together. ISACA in the US is a great organization that has a lot of certifications that really help you understand the process of validating a program and controls, and that's really where GRC starts.
Thank you, guys. Did anyone else want to jump in on that question?
I suppose the bit I'd jump in on, and is a huge frustration for myself, is that actually entry level, getting in at an entry level position anywhere within the whole information cybersecurity world is a real struggle. That we're told that we've got lots and lots of gaps in the workforce in cybersecurity, yet we seem to make it really difficult for people to get in. There's so many examples of entry level positions that suddenly seem to want 5 years experience. That's not an entry level position. So I work and I mentor a lot of young people in these areas as well. Persistence is going to be your friend. Just keep going, keep knocking on those doors, and ignore all the knockbacks you get. Everyone gets these knockbacks. Ignore them. Just carry on. If you can find someone who wants to listen to you, great. If the door's open, then it's your job to start selling. And please demonstrate that you've thought about this. It's not something, I'm thinking of getting into cybersecurity or GRC or whatever. It's, I've done this. These are the projects that I've done. this is what I've looked at, I've read these books or whatever. Show people that you really have that interest. And if you're in front of a hiring manager, anyone here, any of our peers and colleagues, if you show that determination and keenness, you're much more likely to get in there.
Just one more thing from me to add, just on the proactivity element. So in years gone by, a popular route into GRC was from the compliance end of the spectrum, implementing management systems, going through certification processes. So much of our world now revolves around managing and governing risk, that actually being technical enough, everybody says, there's plenty of roles that aren't technical in the GRC space, but actually what we really need is people to have a really good grasp and understanding of the risks that we face. And for me, sometimes the more technical, the better. So actually getting your hands dirty, getting into coding, getting into capture the flag, getting into understanding what our threats really look like, and having an appreciation of what the threat environment looks like is now a really great place to come into the GRC world with an understanding of actually what we're protecting against.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really, really great advice there. So yeah, we're rapidly coming to the near the end of the session. So I think I might just conclude by perhaps coming to each of you for some final thoughts on how you think the field of cyber risk management and governance will evolve over the coming years. So perhaps if I could start with you, Ian, on your quick final thoughts on that. I'll just on.
Yeah. I think if we look at what's driving this, we live in this ultra-connected world where everything's interconnected and everything is interdependent. And we've gone past the point of no return now, where our lives, certainly in the Western world, depends on all of this. And the risks are only going to get worse, and the impact and implications are only going to get worse. So from a GRC perspective, we are going to see more legislation. We are going to see more compliance requirements. We must also make sure that whilst all this is happening, we don't fall into the trap of security by compliance. My old mantra, compliance doesn't give you good security, but good security gives you compliance. And it's important to remain focused, as these things evolve.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. Perhaps I come to you for your quick final thoughts.
I think transparency is going to be the absolute word. Whether it's transparency within the company, external with the company, and all the reporting requirements and things we have to see. Cybersecurity is continuing to be a team sport, not only within the company, but within the industry, the regulating bodies, and the government. And everybody, you see everybody's coming together to provide guidance to the operators on what good cybersecurity should look like. So we're going to see more and more of, standard framework, everybody aligning to standard frameworks. We're going to see more and more standardized reporting, both internal and external. And so I think we're going to see a lot of opportunities for companies that sit on the low end of capability and understanding to really raise their game. And that's through kind of the teaming activity we see between regulating bodies, government organizations, providing guidance, and really also those organizations focusing on the threat. I think we're going to see a whole level of focus from industry and government pushing out towards the threat as well. So I think we've got a fun few years in front of us. They're not going to be easy, but we're going to see a much bigger and higher level of transparency within a company and external with our regulators and our industry partners.
Thank you so much. Mark, over to you next.
Yeah, I think I would get a bit aspirational here, because I think governance has more power than it realizes. And certainly the report we did last year emphasized the fact that it has significant, done right, you'll be involved in, helping an organization transform. You'll start to get it to live up to its ethical demands, and you'll be potentially part of a massive culture change within an organization. There's real a profound sense of sort of accomplishment possible with it. I think sometimes governance is too much about ticking boxes and the other. It really isn't. You should look higher, further, faster, and that's appreciate what governance can do for you and for your organisation as well. It's it's no small thing to be involved with.
Thank you, Mark, and some very quick final thoughts, Martin.
Yeah, I think stop thinking that you're a cyber governance or a cyber risk person. You're an enterprise governance or an enterprise risk person. It's much more about that holistic enterprise view of things rather than the siloed cyber view of things.
Thank you. And finally, to Law.
So, integrated governance still obviously needs cyber information security professionals within the governance, risk, compliance realm, but totally integrated governance. And of course, when we look at emerging technologies, we look at the power of building and baking AI into everything, much as we're connecting everything together, and we're living in an interconnected world of SaaS, that everything's connected through APIs. Data governance, integrated business governance, it's going to be really important to look at things in the round and accept that things are constantly moving. And that's where this risk and transparency piece also comes into play, right? Risk management kind of then becomes the glue. When we're looking at why we need to do that in the face of regulation, being held responsible for our actions as organizations, what was reasonable to do to protect both the organization and its customers, and what was reasonable to prioritize above other things. So integrated governance and risk transparency, good risk reporting, and well-informed decision-making, they're all going to become absolutely key factors in everything that we do. Not that they aren't already, but just becoming more and more important and prominent in terms of visibility and importance.
Brilliant. Lovely way to conclude the session, I think. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for this session. I hope you enjoyed it. Really interesting conversation. I think one that we could easily do another hour on at least. But a massive thank you to our speakers, Ian, Matt, Mark, Law, and Martin, for your time and joining, for your insights for this session. Really appreciate it. A big thank you as well to S&P Global Ratings for sponsoring this session. And of course, a massive thank you to our audience for tuning in and engaging with the discussion. So our next session in the online summit will be coming around very quickly. This will be Solving the Unsolved, Effective Strategies for OT Security Challenges. So stay tuned for that. But thank you again for listening, and this session's now ending. Thank you.